Alternative to the dot snapping system that we discussed previously, we also have grid. Whenever you activate grid, you're using something called the dynamic grid, which is basically a grid that's aimed to show up only at the cursor and be as unobtrusive as possible, aiming to do the basic purposes of grid and really nothing more. However, for users requiring something a little bit more contemporary, we do also offer the option for a static grid. So once we toggle that, we see that our grid is overridden with static, and we have a plethora of static settings we're able to deal with. So static grid is a little bit more different because it actually has borders. But one of my favorite things about static grid is you can right click and actually get it to stay in place. Another thing about static grid is you can hold Control Shift and right click in order to dynamically adjust your grid. We can hold Shift and scroll in order to add subdivisions on this grid on the fly. We can press Escape to cancel it. We could also have this grid be the same color as the mode that's at hand. So right now we're in cut, so our grid is red. If we were to press D, change over to slice, we see that our grid is now yellow. We can jump over to blue, see the grid as a knife grid for blue box. But just like that, we can jump back over to red, which is my default state that I normally am working from. So by turning that off, we can have the grid just be vanilla and generic for every state without it having any sort of color inheritance. The next thing I want to talk about is grid overlay, which by toggling this off, it will make the Blender grid disappear whenever you're working in an orthographic view. So here I am looking at it from the side. When I hold Control, we can see that all the Blender grids disappeared, just leaving me with my own grid. I can press Escape to cancel. It brings back the Blender grids. Same thing for all the other views. We see that the grids just disappear whenever that setting is on. Always in front basically means that the grid will always be in front no matter what. So here we have the grid actually being tracked to this inside face, but we see the grid actually showing through the mesh as if always in front was on. So if we go in and we toggle this and remove it and bring up the grid again, we see that now the grid is actually placed behind the object, which gives me a better idea of where the grid's placed. But sometimes you actually want to see the grid no matter what all the time. So that's where always in front comes in. The next thing I want to talk about is auto transparency. This one is on by default, and what this means is that whenever you have your grid out, let's draw it normally. Right now I'm still orienting it to a local edge. If we press Alt V and we look at our wireframe, we see that this is the edge that more than likely the grid is trying to orient itself to. So if we freeze it and lock it down just like so, and we begin drawing, we see that the grid actually goes semi-transparent during draw, and if I right click and cancel, we see that the grid is back at full illumination. So just like that, there's a lot of versatility whenever it comes to static grid for you being able to reduce this transparency while you're working, always show it in front in the event that you don't want it obscured by objects in your way, by having the Blender grids disappear and even having the grid colored the same way as the mode that's at hand. So the mode color isn't so much used with static grid because really I'm just getting in here to just use the static grid. I don't need to really know the mode because I'm already aware of it. But just in case, you can always just toggle these behaviors off and on to really get the most out of static grid. And there's plenty of videos actually talking about static grid in depth on my channel. So in the event that you want to find out more information, there's definitely a lot of reasons to give both of these grids a shot.